Saturday. It's been an intense week. But I hope will be an inspiring, uplifting, and still very important conversation around the climate crisis. We originally held this event for the press at the end of September, so we're restreaming it today for the public, and I'll be looking forward to addressing your questions. We're streaming on Twitch, Periscope, Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. And I'll say before we dive into the panel, let me first note the people who you'll see on it. We're moderated by the Young Turks' former executive producer, Gina Kim. And the people I was very excited to be joined by include Indigenous water defender, Joye Braun, and climate scientist, Peter Calmess. And each of them had really important perspectives about the climate crisis and ways that we can respond to it. Before we dive into the panel, I want to just invite everybody. Tomorrow at 2 p.m. Pacific, we'll be hosting a volunteer session. I'll be answering questions, and it'll be a chance to learn how you can help us as we sprint into the finish line of our impending election. And you can visit us there again tomorrow, 2 p.m. Pacific at shahid.fyi/GOTV. That's for Get Out the Vote. With no further ado, let's get into it. I'm looking forward to everybody hearing from Gina and Joy and Peter. John, do you want to roll the panel?
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us here today on this climate crisis panel to talk about the Green New Deal now and the importance of it and the state of our climate today as it is. I'm Gina Kim, and we have a great panel of leaders that will talk to you about the situation that we have today. And to start this panel, I would like to kick it off with one of our great guests here, Joye Braun. She's a veteran pipeline fighter with the Indigenous Environmental Network, fighting Keystone XL and Dakota Access pipelines. She's the first person to pitch a teepee in resistance to Standing Rock. And with that, I would like to pass this over to Joy.
Ampatu washte yu happy chante washte nape to use happy wambly weakly imach happy. My name is Eagle Feather Woman, or Joye Braun, a member of the Cheyenne River Sioux tribe in South Dakota. And yes, we are fighting Keystone XL currently and still fighting, no dapple. When we talk about climate change and climate justice, we really need to remember that we need to start centering Indigenous voices, that this is Indigenous land, that so-called America has only been here for a very short time. So-called America, so-called Canada, so-called Mexico, that this is really our land. This is Indigenous land, and we know our own land very well. And as we have risen, as Indigenous voices have risen, and as we have fought to be at the table, it's time for us and time for the world to start listening to us, whether it's here in so-called America, whether it's in New Zealand, whether it's in China. Indigenous people need to start listening to. Here in the so-called South Dakota, this is Ocheti Shakoi territory, are the 7 council fires. One of the things that we're noticing on the ground here when it comes to climate change is the desertification of the Missouri River Basin. And we see that with water not being in the rivers like they're supposed to be. We see that with large grass fires. It was only less than a month ago that 3 large grass fires almost made us run from my own home here in Eagle Butte, South Dakota, just as the wildfires were hitting on the West Coast. So I urge everybody to start paying attention to to your surroundings, and to remember that water is truly life. Without water and without the sky and the air that we breathe, we're not going to be able to survive. So I'll pass it back to you for a minute, because I know we didn't want to talk too long.
Thank you so much, Joy. Thank you for that. Next up, and for those who are just newly joining us, again, we want to thank you so much for joining this climate crisis panel on the Green New Deal now. As I mentioned at the start of this call, we have a few great speakers, panelists here to join us today. We will be opening this up shortly for Q&A where we can have an open dialogue. And we just heard from Joye Braun, the veteran pipeline fighter for the Indigenous Environmental Network. And next up now, I'd like to introduce Peter Calmess. He is a Los Angeles-based climate scientist, wrote an op-ed for the LA Times dated September 12th, titled "With Global Heating, Expect Inferno Seasons in the American West." And with that, I'd like to hand this over now to Peter.
Hi, thanks, Gina. It's hard to know where to start when talking about climate and ecological breakdown. There's just such a disconnect between what I see as a scientist and what I see the public and even journalists, reporting on, and the public thinking about, and the state of the dialogue. From my view, this is what's happening on the planet right now at about only a little bit over 1 degree Celsius of global heating above pre-industrial levels. And we're on track right now to blow well past another half a degree. So what we're experiencing now is going to get worse, much worse. And I can say that with 100% certainty because we understand the basic physics of what's happening right now so well. And, this global heat is quite simply being driven by burning fossil fuels. Like it couldn't, in some ways scientifically, it couldn't be more simple, the overarching story there. And now we're starting to experience it with our bodies in real time, especially on the US West Coast, so I'm in Los Angeles. We had a heat wave here a couple of weeks ago, which lasted for a few days, and many areas surpassed 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Like it's starting to get ridiculous even to talk about breaking records because we're on this slope of getting hotter and hotter and hotter. So of course we're breaking more and more records every year. And it's not the new normal. So please don't use that term because we aren't stabilized yet. We're as a species, our emissions of greenhouse gases are still rising exponentially. So the US has flattened, but globally it hasn't gone down, but it's flattened. I think we've probably outsourced some of our emissions to other nations. But globally speaking, it's still rising exponentially with no end in sight. We have nations saying that this is an existential crisis and still subsidizing the fossil fuel industry and still pursuing new sources of fossil fuel as if there wasn't an emergency right now. So that's where I'm basically coming from. I think this is a life or death emergency. I think more and more people on the US West Coast and in the Bay Area are understanding that with their bodies because they've been breathing in smoke for weeks. So it's the combination of the heat waves, the fires destroying towns and lives and killing people directly, and then this very long tail of very damaging, very dangerous, toxic air that we're now being forced to breathe. So this has to be, in my opinion, a top priority for humanity at this point.
Thank you very much, Peter. Now I'd like to introduce our third panelist here, Shahed Bhutar, congressional candidate for California CD12, challenging Nancy Pelosi. And with that, I hand this over to you, Shahed.
Thank you, Gina. It is alarming to everyone, particularly on the West Coast, how dramatically failed has been the generation of policymakers that preceded us in Congress. The failure of the establishment has literally been written in the sky. On September 9th, our skies in San Francisco were blood red at high noon. And I can't think of a more visible demonstration of the failure of a longstanding policy paradigm than for the sky to change colors because, due to events indirectly related to our concerted inaction and frankly, willful ignorance. I see a lot of people in the Democratic Party claim to understand climate science while refusing to show up for the policies demanded by it. And it is that failure of leadership that frankly has compelled our campaign to represent San Francisco in Congress. It's one reason why I'm so excited to embrace and help secure the consensus favoring the Green New Deal and other intersectional policies to help build climate justice. I'm eager beyond the Green New Deal ultimately to nationalize fossil fuel industries, to remove the profit incentive from resource plunder, to protect the future from the predation of the present. I'm also very eager ultimately to address the ways through our belligerent, abusive, and militaristic foreign policy that we have accelerated and exacerbated the climate crisis. The climate crisis has intersectional roots. It will take intersectional solutions. At the moment, I see corporate Democrats standing effectively for none of them. And it's all the more reason that we need to force some change in Washington. As the first Democrat in a generation to face Nancy Pelosi in a general election, I'm very eager to offer my city that opportunity, and I'm looking forward to representing us in the next session of Congress.
Thank you so much, Shahed. I think at this point now, we can pretty much turn this over to a Q&A portion of this panel. So with that, if anyone here has a question, we would ask you to raise your hand and we will unmute you to ask your question. And if there are no questions, we have had questions that were sent to us in advance. And so with that, I think feel free at any point to interrupt and raise your hand. But right now, we'll start it off with some of the questions that have been emailed to us in advance already. And I'd like to actually address Joy first. Joy, we had a question coming in here asking, what did we learn from Standing Rock and KXL?
We learned a lot of things from the Dakota Access Pipeline fight at Standing Rock. You know, that was the first time since Greasy Grass, the Battle of Little Bighorn, that the Ocheti Shakoi met the Seven Council Fathers, the Great Sioux Nation, met all together with our allies, Arapaho, Cheyenne, Mandan, Hidatsa, Arikara. But there was also over 120 other indigenous nations that came. Indigenous people came from the global south, from Brazil and Central America, as well as all the way from the Arctic all the way to the south. And that's the first time that ever happened. And what that did is it released this great spiritual energy into the world. And everywhere you go around the United States now, even including on Black Lives Matter's protests, you're going to find them saying, just like Standing Rock. So, and the things that we learned up there is we told people that this militarization of police was going to start affecting people in the cities. And you've seen that happen this past summer. You've seen the everyday person get tear gassed and rubber bullets and maced. In all of those things I've experienced. I've been tear gassed, I've had rubber bullets shot at me, I've been maced. We've had police beat us, all kinds of crazy stuff. Just this last Friday, we had a protest, a rally about Keystone XL, and we went up against police brutality here on the reservation. Luckily, we were able to reach out across to the police, and we started to come across an understanding. So that's a good thing, because we do need to defund the police. A lot of things we learned at Standing Rock. We learned that we can't let the allies take over, that we need to, no matter what, if you're on the front line, you let the community people in that community be the voices of that community. And don't let people come in and tell you what to do or say what to do. So there's so many things that we learned from Standing Rock. It truly was a revitalization of allies. And man, you know, when you used to walk through Ocheti Shakoi, I used to be able to pull up to the Puyallup or the Nisqually or the Omaha or the Tulalip or the Cherokee. I used to be able to pull up along all these many different tribes that came. And that friendship started to build a movement within the indigenous communities here in the United States. and elsewhere, in global South and so-called Canada. Because remember, those borders crossed us. We didn't cross those borders.
Joy, thank you so much for that. And as a follow-up, I mean, having participated in all of these protests and really being on the front line and a leader in this movement, how do you think Democrats have shown up for the Indigenous climate protests?
Well, the Democrats are listening. So last year in Iowa, we had the first Indigenous presidential debate. And Bernie was there, and Kalama was there, and all these different people that were running for president at the time showed up, or they came in on video. Unfortunately, Biden didn't come, but they did listen to some of our demands, and one of our demands was that they stop the Keystone XL pipeline and the Dakota Access Pipeline, that they make a promise to protect, and that because remember, President Trump, within 3 days of coming into office, signed Keystone XL and signed for Dakota Access Pipeline to be pushed through. And we always call the Keystone XL pipeline that zombie pipeline because we've killed it 4 times. And here I am fighting it again, right? And but President Biden, I'm going to call him that because we really do hope that he does become president. He did promise to pledge against Keystone XL and Dakota Access, but he's also listened with regards to our missing and murdered Indigenous women, and they've been listening to some of the other things that we've been calling very recently land back. Now in Oklahoma, there was a case on the McGritt case, and that's going to have impacts that we don't even know yet. And I look at that McGritt case, and then I look at the Black Hills, for instance, and I look at the 1851 and the 1868 Fort Laramie Treaty that my tribe made, and I think maybe we can get our land back. I would love that. If we got our 1851 treaty land back, that's about the size of the state of Ohio. I would love that. So yeah, they've shown up for us in some good ways. At least they're open to listening.
Great, yeah. Thank you so much for that, Joy. Now I want to move on to more of an impact question for Peter here, since you're a scientist. If you can talk to us about what are some of the implications for global heating.
Well, so I think that I would like to think that the public's getting pretty well versed in that by now. I mean, so let me start with the recent wildfires in California, Oregon, and Washington. I can say without any hesitation that increased heat is the biggest driver of those fires. So when you have a heat wave, and heat waves are more extreme now and more than 3 times as likely globally as they were in the 1960s because of global heating. When you have a heat wave, it's like a giant sponge that just sucks moisture right out of the fuel and right out of the plants, which makes them far easier to ignite. And when they do ignite, they can burn much more quickly, and it's much more difficult to control them. And that's why it's absolutely remarkable. In 2018, which was a record fire season for California, 1.7 million acres were burned. I think we're up to over 3.6 million right now. So more than twice as many. The area that's burned so far in 2020 is already over twice the record in California's history. And fires all over the state are still burning strong. And we still have maybe 3, maybe 4 months left in fire season. So it's what's happening right now because of global heating it just makes my head spin. It's so much, it's getting so much worse, so much more quickly than even I could have thought. And the projections for mid-century are pretty dire. In the US West, we can probably, one study says we can probably expect between a factor of 2 and 6 times more burned area per year on average. You know, these heat waves are just there. That's the thing that's driving it. These heat waves are getting stronger and stronger because of this energy imbalance, because the same amount of sunlight's coming in, but not as much infrared radiation can escape to space because it encounters that additional, those additional CO2 molecules, which absorb the outgoing radiation. And then instead of going to space, they re-radiate it in all directions. So some of it comes back down. So then the Earth has to get hotter so it can radiate more energy. So like the same amount escapes to space as what's coming in from the sun. It's pretty, again, like I said, it's very basic physics. And that's what's driving this increase in extreme heat waves. And then there's many other synergistic effects that are driving these mega fires that we're living through right now. So for example, we have less snow in the winter and we have earlier snow melt. So your dry season gets longer. We have periods of exacerbated drought that can last for years. So again, your summers get drier, your fuel gets drier, it gets even easier to ignite. We have trees living in conditions that they did not evolve to live in. So they're stressed by heat, they're stressed by lack of water, and they're more susceptible to being killed by disease and by insects. And these bark beetles, which are killing huge areas of our forest, are their populations are exploding because winters are milder, and that was one of the main checks on their populations. So there's all these interlocking effects that are leading to these megafires, which all come down ultimately to global heating because of the CO2 that we're emitting. And then this is just the beginning. We also see, you know, worsening hurricanes. We see decreasing crop yields. We see a need to irrigate more, which is a huge stress on our water system. We see sea level rising, which means, you know, I don't see how we can possibly avoid abandoning large parts of coastal cities around the world now, including cities in the United States. And there may even be some areas in San Francisco that are affected by sea level rise. And then that's just how kind of physical Earth systems are changing. We're losing ecosystems too, is another impact that I want to mention, such as like the forests that I already mentioned. How much longer will we have Joshua trees and giant sequoia trees in the state of California? Look at what's happening to the coral reefs. How much longer will the planet have the Great Barrier Reef, for example? These are just the physical Earth system changes, and then how do those changes impact civilizational systems? So humanity is an ecosystem on this planet. It's a species like any other species. We call our habitat civilization. And we have all of these infrastructure systems and water systems and food systems and geopolitical systems. That's a huge one. So for example, humid heat. So as the planet keeps getting warmer, if we don't take radical action very quickly, so we need massive systems change very quickly. If we don't take that kind of action, by the end of the century, in areas of the tropical Earth, where perhaps up to 1 billion people live. So I'm talking about Indonesia and Africa and Central America and parts of South America, Northern Australia, India, just huge numbers of people living in these tropical areas where their bodies could no longer, every day of the year will potentially, by the end of the century, be above threshold for deadly humid heat, which means your body has a very difficult time actually keeping itself at 98.6 degrees, and people will start to experience, without air conditioning, they'll start to experience heat exhaustion and heat stroke. So those hundreds of millions or maybe even 1 billion people are going to have to start leaving those areas of the planet. And the geopolitical implications of that, I think, are sort of mind-bending. So that's those are just some of the things that that I'm looking at right now from where I'm sitting, just top of mind.
Thank you so much, Peter. I mean, with that, we have some other questions here. I'm going to pivot, But with such a dire outlook, clearly this will have an impact on jobs. And so I'd like to actually pivot over to Shahed and talk about why a Green New Deal and how a Green New Deal will impact jobs and the economy of our country.
The biggest way the Green New Deal is going to impact the economy of this country is by ensuring that people can survive the future. But beyond that, one critical component of the Green New Deal is an industrial transformation embodied in a just transition, including a federal jobs guarantee. And I've heard from any number of people who haven't closely examined the policy that they're committed to and share the renewable energy commitments in the Green New Deal, for instance, but that they are skeptical of or don't understand why included within the vision is also this industrial transformation. And I just want to make the point as to why it's important for the industrial transformation to be included in the commitment to renewable energy, simply because what the vision has always fallen on the shoals of before have been established industrial interests, industries and labor unions beholden to fossil fuel industries. Unless there are opportunities for those folks, for that workforce, to be repurposed and retrained and redeployed, for instance, in green jobs, it's going to be really hard to effectuate the policy. It will be difficult to achieve the consensus for transformation politically because the market has such established force behind it. Now, this is one reason why I ultimately would like to nationalize fossil fuel companies, because you might ask, why is our species being driven off a cliff? Because some industrial interests have a money incentive in continuing the current paradigm. And that's a great question that frankly doesn't have a good answer. There is no good reason for our species to be driven off a cliff to profit some people today. And if we are to meaningfully, in the context of our government, respond to this crisis, we're going to have to make some very dramatic changes. And the only way to make those dramatic changes palatable to the public is to ensure that everybody gets to come along. And that's what the federal jobs guarantee does, is it ensures that for everyone in the coming green economy that we're building, that there'll be opportunities for everyone to participate and to thrive. And that particularly meets the concerns, I think, of, for instance, coal miners in West Virginia, who have historically been one among many voting blocs that have limited the public appetite for transformative energy solutions. And so that's one way that the Green New Deal will affect jobs in the country. And just to go back to where I started, I think the biggest way it's going to help the economy is simply by ensuring that people are around to survive the future. Our economy is not going to survive if our communities don't. And it's important to recognize that climate chaos is already killing Californians every year. And that's just the people who die in the wildfires. Think about the people who are displaced. Think about, and Peter alluded to this, but the long-term epidemiological impacts of, for instance, like what the toxic smoke we've all been breathing for the last several months is going to do to populations across the West Coast in the coming years. We've never had an opportunity to study it before. The air quality here was among the worst in the world for sustained periods of time. Not everybody had access to N95 masks. Certainly have been in very scarce supply on account of the pandemic. Even before that, air filtration, is not widely available. And so the idea that the people that we know have been killed by climate change today undercounts and underregards the long-term impact that will ultimately reveal itself. And that's just in the fires that have happened now. As Peter alludes, they are inevitable going forward unless we make some very sharp choices. And then maybe just the last thing I'd say before I turn it back to you, Gina, Joy had mentioned that Democrats have been willing to listen to climate justice movements. And I would just say the reason I'm running for Congress to replace Nancy Pelosi is precisely because that's all Democrats have done, is listened and sat on their hands. And the climate delay of the Democratic leadership is as bad as climate denial. In fact, I'll take it further. I think it's worse. Republicans who deny climate change are certainly willfully ignorant at this point, but we could still say they're ignorant. Democrats who refuse to do anything while claiming to believe the science stand on a particularly precarious moral precipice, because to understand the science and the risk to the future and still choose to do nothing about it because their corporate contributors are committed to filling their and the executives and the investors' pockets, that's absolutely corrupt and unacceptable. And it is precisely the limits of Democrats to be willing to listen and do nothing further that frankly compelled me to enter this race.
Thank you, Shahed. You actually answered the next two questions, but let's see if you have anything further to add to the question is if you feel the Democratic Party has shown up for the Green New Deal, but I think in what you just said, you were pretty explicit about that.
I can put wheels on the car. In the last session, Nancy Pelosi was the target of a sit-in by at the time, very new member of Congress, first-term Representative Ocasio-Cortez, in collaboration with the Sunrise Movement and many others, sat in. Pelosi's office was one of the first things that happened in this congressional session, and it did, to Joy's point, force some, ultimately only theatrical change. Pelosi did feel compelled to allow the creation for the first time of a congressional committee focused on the climate crisis, the Select Committee on the Climate Crisis. But, and this gets to the point I'm making about listening and doing nothing further, in allowing that committee to be created, Nancy Pelosi also affirmatively hamstrung it. Congress does several things. Among them are investigation, that's oversight, and legislation, that's policymaking. When they created the new committee, the Select Committee on the Climate Crisis, Pelosi ensured that it had neither investigative authority nor legislative authority. They can't investigate and they can't legislate, which is to say it's a committee that has been reduced to window dressing precisely because the party leadership puts the interests of industrial fossil fuel extraction and dependent industries before the health and safety of our communities and the survivability of this planet for everyone's grandchildren. And that is a corrupt choice. It's an unacceptable choice, and it's a choice that we have an opportunity to change when we change some figures in Congress, hopefully starting this November.
Great, thank you so much. I'd like to circle back to you, Joy, to talk about what Indigenous wisdom is being overlooked in our discussions on climate change.
Well, a lot of that wisdom really looks at what is available in your own surroundings, and it's also a relationship. It's a relationship with not only ourselves, but also the world around us. So the way that I introduced myself, for example, when we first started this, was I said who I was, I said where I was from. That says who I am accountable to. In most Western societies, it's when you introduce yourself, you talk about the degrees you did, the awards you won. It's all me, right? So it's a very linear way of thinking. We think in more terms of circular. And when we talk about circular relationships, I want to go back to what Shahed said about just transitions. Because when we start talking about just transitions in this Green New Deal and talking about looking at the people that are the most dispossessed, who in this country is the most dispossessed? You're talking about migrant workers. You're talking about people that, like my people, up until this COVID, before we got COVID money here, we had 94% unemployment on my reservation. Can you imagine that? This is what you guys are going to start facing out there because of all this climate catastrophe that we are in right now. So unless we start looking at our relationships, not only within ourselves and our communities, but also the surrounding areas around us. So we start talking about just transitions. Here in the Dakotas, that's wind energy, that's solar energy, that's geothermal energy. These are all green energies that we can use and get away from fossil fuels. Because when we're pulling out the oil from the ground, that's Unchi Maka, that's Mother Earth's blood. So if you take away somebody's blood, can they really function? We have to think of the earth as a being, the waters as a living entity, the oil as her blood. And we are responsible for that. You talk about wisdom, Indigenous wisdom. I'm not an elder. I'm a boots on the ground person. I'm a person that gets out there and gets dust thrown at me. I'm a person that will sweat in 120-degree weather, because we do get 120-degree weather here. And I can only tell you what I've seen on the ground and what I've experienced. And what I know is that we have no other choice and to start moving towards a more equitable economy and moving towards just transitions, and really start listening to the earth and paying attention and taking care of one another. Because if we're not taking care of one another, and I think that's something that this COVID has been teaching us, because with all the sadness and the loss that we've experienced with COVID, you still have to look to what we can learn from it. And we've seen a lot of mutual aid. We've seen communities starting to come together. We've seen people reaching out across the internet to relatives that they may not have talked to before or may not have spent much time with before. And those are the relationships that we need.
Thank you so much, Joy, for that wisdom and for all of your hard work and just putting yourself out there in the front line.
Two thoughts just on themes that Joy raised. One, you mentioned the Indigenous wisdom, and I appreciate you mentioned that you're not an elder. You're still bringing very profound wisdom to the conversation. And when you talked about petroleum, for instance, being the blood of the earth and water as living, one of the pieces of Indigenous wisdom that I've been very inspired by is the understanding that natural resources are not ours to exploit. There is this intergenerational theft implicit in every manner of resource extraction, whether it's mining minerals, whether it's petroleum, and this pretension in our conception of property that anything, John Locke speaks of it explicitly, that anything we extract from the earth is ours once we mix our labor with it. It is frankly preposterous, because the things we pull out of the ground, none of us made those things. They long preceded us, and we have no legitimate claim to them. And so the model of property ownership as it relates to resource extraction and the profit motive that compels plunder, theft from the future at institutional industrial scale and mass, that is a policy choice, and it is senseless. It has long been abusive, but as the climate crisis has grown more critical and inescapable, it's no longer abusive to others. It is now abusive to ourselves, and it is abusive to the future that we all share. And this element of Indigenous wisdom, I think, has crucial implications for how we construe property in our legal system and what we allow to be monetized and what we should not allow to be monetized. This is one reason why I'm very eager ultimately to nationalize fossil fuel extraction industries. I see that as a policy, frankly, compelled by this Indigenous wisdom and this understanding that we can't continue to treat the earth as a resource for us to literally mine. And then there was a second piece that Joy raised that I also thought was really powerful, and that was the way that which our communities responding to the pandemic have developed new networks that are doing everything from feeding each other and our communities to joint childcare resources, bicycle repair co-ops. There's a million ways that communities come together to provide and share resources. And this idea that we are building the capacity at the grassroots local layer across our country for people to get by without needing to embrace the market, without needing to use or get money, to be able to survive without needing exchange. What's so crucially powerful about that, not only does it build an alternative industrial system, but it particularly enables the capacity for sustained work stoppage. Sustained work stoppage, general strikes, it is the most powerful tool available to we the people to compel compliance by our institutions when they run amok. And the only way we can embrace that tool is when we have sufficient community resiliency that people can still put food on the table and be sure that their kids will survive. And at the moment, too many of us are reliant on the market for survival. But when communities build the resilience that we don't need to be reliant on the market for survival, and that's exactly what the mutual aid and other projects responding to the pandemic are building, is that capacity. Community gardening is an incredibly profound political act because it enables community independence from industrialized systems that, as we've discussed, have been horrendously and blindly abusive to the present and the future. And I share Joy's hope that the maybe the silver lining in the dark cloud of the pandemic is the way that we the people have responded, and that we are showing up to the call of this moment to meet and engage our neighbors, to build greater community capacity for self-care and mutual aid, and hopefully to turn that into the defense of our republic and our shared environment in the future.
if I can add a brief comment, what Joy said really resonated with me as well. And I see climate and ecological breakdown as coming from, there's a direct kind of genealogy there from this colonial extractivist mindset, which certain cultures of humanity have been engaged in for hundreds of years. So, you know, from the genocide of indigenous peoples in North America and elsewhere, to the enslavement of Black bodies in the early stages of this nation, that same mindset which said, we will take from the natural world and we will take from the bodies of others so that we can have profit. And there's a concept in some Eastern North American indigenous cultures of the Wendigo. Joy, I don't know if you've heard of that, but it's this being which is unbalanced by greed, and it just wants to eat everything, and it kind of it becomes this mad thing. And in some ways, what we're experiencing now with climate and ecological breakdown is there's no separateness from those other things that we've been talking about. And this is one thing that's really interesting right now that's happening in the grassroots movement is I sense a merging of movements. So we have movements from indigenous peoples, and we have movements for racial justice, and we have movements for climate justice. And they're all fighting against the same thing, this mindset of extraction for profit above all else. And so these movements naturally are starting to merge as more and more people wake up to this and what this is doing, what this has done to us, and what this is doing to us, and what this means for people in the future too.
Thank you so much, Peter. I'd like to take this discussion now over to some, not final thoughts, but questions. We'll start with you, Joy, in terms of what does climate resistance to you look like over the next decade?
Over the next decade, I see more allies being made, because it's just like what was just said just before here, that intersectionality is being seen. You know, a lot of this stuff started with the doctrine of discovery by the Catholic Church, and then you had manifest destiny. And all of this stuff is based off of capitalism and greed. It's all based off of greed. We have the opportunity now to really make a moral choice as individuals. I don't care what religion you are, if you're no religion at all. I don't care. What I care about is that we as individuals have free will, and we can fight the system that has been put in place to oppress us as individuals. I see that the continued fight for Indigenous justice is going to continue. And with that, I hope that people start understanding whose land they're really on. Like there in San Francisco, Ohlone tribe is there. And I love San Francisco. I love it. It's a beautiful city. It's so much fun to go hang out there. And I've met so many amazing people there. And I just see a lot more connections happening. And as those connections, because one of the things that this corporate people are really afraid of, they're truly afraid of unity. They're truly afraid of people becoming united. And they will do everything they can to stop us. And you guys have seen that this past summer with the militarization of the police and the threats of Trump saying that he's going to try to stay in office and all that other baloney, which we know is ridiculous. But I know that the people will rise up. I have great faith in the youth. I have great faith in the youth. The youth here ran from Standing Rock all the way to Washington, D.C. And they have the ability to not carry the luggage that we have on our backs. And just think of, and they dream, and they make those dreams happen. So I have great faith in what's going to happen. There's going to be a lot of challenges. We will be challenged unlike we've never seen before. We will be challenged and people will be hurt, but we will rise above that. Remember, we as Indigenous people, we've already faced genocide. We've already faced the almost extinction of our people, and we've fought back. When I was a little girl, there were less than 1 million of us. And now there's over 3 million of us. So I have faith. I have a lot of faith.
Thank you so much, Joy. I'd like to take it to Peter now and get your thoughts and what you feel we need to do to address climate justice over the next decade.
Yeah, great question. So I strongly feel, this is my opinion, but given all of the science that I see and the projections and my knowledge of how things are, when I was speaking before about the impacts we can expect, it just sounds like science fiction, right? And it's just, to me, it's crazy that this is all very solid science. I mean, I would love nothing more to be wrong about these dire projections. So with that said, the goal of achieving net zero carbon emissions by 2050 is straight up climate denial. It couldn't be more clear. It's a way to make it sound like you have a plan and like you're going to do something without actually doing something, because we all know that your policymakers in the US have 4-year or 8-year terms. So 2050 is comfortably enough in the future that it basically means that, you know, the buck doesn't have to stop with them. And then net zero. We have to get down to zero emissions, not net zero emissions. What net zero means is that it means that actions that we take now or over the next decade, or over the next 2 decades, can be much less aggressive, because there's this magical technology assumed that we can somehow magically suck carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and put it back underground. So that's effectively like running the last 200 years of the global economy in reverse. And it would be incredibly expensive, require an incredible amount of infrastructure, and we don't even know if it's technologically feasible, let alone economically feasible. So to assume that we can put that on the shoulders of our poor children at the same time that they're going to be dealing with mega fires that make this year look like nothing, and hurricanes that make this year's hurricane system look like nothing, and all kinds of crazy geopolitics that we can't imagine, wars breaking out, not just millions of climate migrants, but possibly billions of climate migrants. So they're going to be dealing with all of this, and to expect them to, you know, to spend half of their economy trying to suck CO2 out of the atmosphere, it's just not going to happen. So net zero by 2050 is, frankly, denial. We have to go much faster than that. I think more and more people are starting to realize that. We need, right now in California, California can become a leader on climate action by taking very powerful symbolic steps. So for example, instead of saying like, we need to raise mileage standards by 1.2 miles per gallon, you know, Governor Newsom just said we need to have zero gas vehicles sold by 2035. So frankly, switching to electric cars is not going to solve this problem, but that's the kind of large scale thinking that we need. And we need that to spread to the federal level, then we need that to spread to the national level. Similarly with fracking, right now is the time to say we can't frack anymore, and that we can't build new fossil fuel infrastructure anymore, and that we need a meaningful Green New Deal. So we have to be careful with this phrase Green New Deal, because it's possible to have a basket of policies which is not anywhere near what we need and still label it a Green New Deal. So we need a meaningful Green New Deal. I completely agree with Shahed that and it sounds radical right now, but I think over the next few years, it'll start to become highly normalized as these catastrophes get worse and worse and more frequent. But I agree with Shahed that we need to nationalize the fossil fuel corporation. We need to end fossil fuel subsidies immediately. That's a no-brainer. And yet the Democratic National Committee did not even put that in their platform this year. They explicitly took that out and said, they explicitly said they support fossil fuel subsidies when we should be making fossil fuels get more and more expensive and subsidizing alternatives like renewable energy. So it's just, we have such a long way to go. And I think that, frankly, the kinds of policies we need, if a policy brings down our carbon emissions, it's a good policy. And if it doesn't, it's not a good policy, or it's not, at least not directly addressing the root cause of what we're dealing with here. So the policy discussion is maybe more straightforward than most people think it is, because it just has to do with reining in these emissions as quickly as we can. Like we need a moratorium on new fossil fuel exploration and production, a moratorium on new fossil fuel infrastructure. I would even go so far as to say that at some point, and it's still probably too radical to talk about right now, we should probably discuss rationing fossil fuels. Because this, again, these kinds of things sound like, they can sound a little too far out there to someone who sees this as just another issue. But once you understand with your body, with your emotions, that this is actually a life or death issue, as more and more people who are living through these megafires right now are starting to feel, I think, then these kinds of previously radical policies start to just sound like common sense.
Life or death en masse, no less, right? I mean, one thing that I think frequently escapes the public conversation, one reason I think corporate Democrats have been so slow in dragging their feet responding to the climate catastrophe, is precisely the fact that people undercount the cost of inaction. No price is too great because of the scale of devastation that we are flirting with if we don't act. You know, when Peter talks about migrations that might encompass billions of people, think about what kind of civilization tearing contortions we've been driven to by the migration of vastly smaller numbers than that, right? The people that are being detained in the concentration camps on our nation's border, subjected to eugenics tactics straight out of the Nazi playbook, they're climate migrants by and large. There's been a drought across Central America for years. And so people don't think about our human rights abuses in the context of migrant detention and climate as related, but that's just a taste of what is to come. You know, the tide of people will only continue to grow as we render more and more of the planet unlivable. And these are not abstract future fears. It is here. It has been here for years, and it's only going to get worse. And I see corporate Democrats, frankly, entirely failing here. I mean, there was the thread, I think it was Peter who was describing the fact that, if we're getting to net zero by 2050, that's basically the contemporary generation of policymakers saying, not my problem. Figure it out when I'm gone. And that's not good enough. We have to bear the consequences of their decisions. And to get really sharp about this, Nancy Pelosi, the head of the Democratic Party, she hasn't debated anyone in 30 years. So how do you get away with not debating anyone for 30 years and then dismissing the Green New Deal in this day and age as the Green New Dream or whatever? How do you get away with that? It astounds me. And if there's a theme I'd raise here, it's that it's not just Trump. Absolutely, the GOP is a huge part of the problem, and climate denialists overtly. But to pretend that voting blue is going to fix the problem when Democrats have been in office, some of them for decades, and chosen to do nothing, is to bury our own heads in the sand. At the end of the day, we need to force change in Washington and in our own households. I don't want to regard the extent to which we each need to embrace behavior change, but at the end of the day, that's not enough. We need policy changes at the federal level to compel the kind of decisions at scale that will protect the future from the predation of the past. And I've seen the generation of policymakers that have been in office, and I've seen their records, and I've seen all too well closely how they've failed the future, and the future can't take any more of that. And I'm not inclined to wait, knowing what is at risk and what is at stake, understanding the magnitude of the risks, I would say compels each of us to find ways to protect the future. One way I'm very eager to protect the future is to end Nancy Pelosi's career and get another vote in the House favoring the Green New Deal.
And just to add to that really quick, so Shahid's, you're committed, right, to never taking money from the fossil fuel industry.
Absolutely.
And that sounds like a small thing, but it's such a huge deal, because if our politics are controlled by the fossil fuel industry, which literally we need to end the fossil fuel industry, it has to go to zero, not get half as big, it has to go completely to zero. So they're going to fight as hard as they can to survive and to keep raking in this free money by extracting the blood of the earth. So as long as they're calling the shots on our policy, we're sunk. So we need policymakers who say enough is enough. I'm never going to take money from those guys.
Great. Thank you all. Thanking the panelists here for a very deep look into our climate crisis and having a deep conversation. We're going to end this panel with some final thoughts. And I'd like to start that off with Shahed, please, to give your final thoughts.
I see a great deal at stake, and the time that we have left to address this crisis diminishing with every passing day. I do hope particularly that the way we've each on the West Coast over the last several months been forced to physically feel the climate crisis, even those of us who haven't lost our homes, even those of us who haven't lost our lives in the wildfires, everyone on the West Coast has been breathing it. And I do hope that the visceral experience of being forced to grapple with the preventable crisis that we have blundered into will wake enough of us up that we can compel better decisions. Now, at the end of the day, Joy was making the point before that we have to each make individual choices, and I absolutely agree with that. It's critical for each of us as moral actors to see through the lies, to, for instance, independently curate our news sources, to connect with our neighbors, to find ways to raise our voices, to connect with social movements, to activate our solidarity. And one thing that we can hope to do as we each make those individual decisions is to get a better grip on our collective decisions, because it's going to take collective change to meet this crisis head on in a way that preserves an opportunity for anyone's grandkids to survive. I very thankfully do not have children of my own. I also am very concerned about everyone else's. And I wish that more policymakers acted like they were too. At the end of the day, no amount of fossil fuel corporate money to any political campaign or political party can offset just the terrifying damage that we allow the future to endure with every passing day that we don't embrace radical change. And I'm grateful to be in a position to propose some ideas. Peter was mentioning that the idea of nationalizing the fossil fuel industry might seem radical now, but it will become increasingly inexorable, I dare say. I'm taking positions before they become popular is not new to me. I've been doing that for 20 years. And I do hope, rather than in the future, yet again, being in a position to say, I told you so, I hope to help our civilization step over some of these predictable pitfalls that we keep stepping into, if only, again, to preserve a future for everyone's grandchildren.
Thank you so much, Shahed. Peter, over to you for your final thoughts.
My final thought's pretty simple. I would just urge every climate activist to support candidates as strongly and as loudly as they can who are clearly climate emergency candidates. So if there's an election that has, say, 2 candidates and one has made it very clear that they are not interested in aggressively pursuing climate action for whatever reason, and the other one is very clearly interested in aggressively pursuing climate action, that's climate activists, no matter how much of a long shot we might think that election is, we should throw all of our weight as loudly and as engaged as possible to wake people up. The scales are tipping in terms of climate being a sort of a politically winnable issue. We saw this in Massachusetts when, through Nancy Pelosi's encouragement, Joe Kennedy primaried Ed Markey, who was one of the co-authors of the Green New Deal. And so that was in some sense a referendum on climate action, and Ed Markey won easily. So the voters saw right through that ploy and said, we want climate action. The same thing's happening in this election too in San Francisco. And again, I would urge climate activists not to assume the outcome here. If we can push Shahed over the top, it would be an absolutely historic and powerful referendum on climate action. No policymaker in the future ever again would be able to speak condescendingly of a Green New Deal.
Thank you so much, Peter. And now I'd like to hand it over the final word to to Joy, our fearless Indigenous fighter and leader. Joy, I'd like to give you the final word.
We have run out of time, period. We have run out of time. The Green New Deal has a lot of good things in it. It has some things that still need to be tweaked. And I urge everybody to really study it and to remember that you have the opportunity to make your voices heard today and to stand up and to rise up. One of the things in the Green New Deal that still needs to be tweaked is the idea of carbon credits and carbon offsets as an economic development plan for Indigenous communities, which is a bunch of hogwash because those policies fuel genocidal acts like in Brazil and my friends in the Sariaku. So we need to stop that. It's a false solution, period. But there's a lot of other really good things in the Green New Deal. And we need to push those things. And we need to encourage our candidates, no matter where they are at, whether it's in California or me in the deep north, in the heart of red country. This is South Dakota with Governor Noem and Senator Thune and all those guys. We have to keep fighting. And so I encourage everybody to stand up and to rise up. Your voice does matter. Your voice matters. And we have run out of time.
Thank you so much, Joy. And we want to thank everybody who joined us today to listen in on this very important panel on climate crisis. And until next time, keep fighting, have faith and hope. Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us live tonight. I hope you enjoyed the panel and learned something. I found Joy's comments for me as a candidate especially inspiring and grounding me in a perspective that long precedes any of us, and to all of us have an opportunity to defend timeless values at the moment. And I see them implicated in the climate crisis and the climate justice movement. Just a couple announcements. So please first share this video. We need your help fighting the mainstream media. We've, on our campaign, endured a more or less complete corporate whiteout. And, you know, I could spiel at length, but I don't think there's any need for that. But we would love for you to share this video with your community, anybody who might be interested in climate justice or Indigenous perspectives or the views of a climate scientist or a candidate challenging an entrenched incumbent. If you're interested in supporting our campaign, we would love to have you. Please join us online at shahid.fyi/volunteer. That'll jump you to our sign-up form. We're actively phone banking, text banking. If you're in the area, we're doing sign delivery, socially distanced outdoor voter outreach actions. I'm on my way to one right now as soon as we wrap up. We've got an amazing team. You can help us from everywhere. We'd love to have your help. Finally, right, your efforts make all the difference as volunteers. And I want to particularly invite, there's an opportunity tomorrow, Sunday, 2 p.m. Pacific. We'll be gathering to do an orientation session. I'll be talking to volunteers. Anybody's welcome to join us. shahid.fyi/GOTV. Forget out the vote. Join us tomorrow at 2. Thanks for joining us today. I hope you find a way to build a movement for climate justice and a brighter future wherever you're at in the meantime. And thank you once again for joining us today. Peace, y'all.